What if I told you that for over a decade, the FBI kept a file on Michael Jackson, a file that wasn't fully released until after his death? Hundreds of pages of government documents, surveillance records, investigation reports, threat assessments, extortion plots, death threats from unstable individuals and self-proclaimed mob associates. And yes, references to two of the most publicized child molestation cases in history. But here's what most people don't know. When those files were finally made public in 2009, 6 months after Michael's death, they didn't quite say what the media had been suggesting for years. In fact, the FBI's own records painted a more complicated picture. This isn't conspiracy theory. This isn't fan fiction. These are official federal documents, obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, now sitting in the FBI's online vault for anyone to read. So why don't more people know what's actually in them? Because the headlines focused on the existence of FBI files, not on what those files really showed. The media reported that Michael Jackson had been on the FBI's radar for years, but they rarely emphasized that the Bureau never charged him with a federal crime. They talked about the accusations, but not the absence of federal prosecution. They emphasized suspicion, but glossed over the outcome. Today, we're going to walk through what the FBI actually collected on Michael Jackson. Not the tabloid version, not the gossip. The real files. We'll see what the Bureau was asked to investigate, why they were involved, who was threatening Michael's life, and what their documented role was in the most serious accusations ever made against him. Because inside these documents, there's a story about more than just one man. It's a story about how fame makes you a target, how media narratives can override facts, and how even when the most powerful investigative agency in the United States does not bring charges, public perception doesn't always follow the evidence. Michael Jackson was one of the most scrutinized entertainers in American history. Local police, state agencies, district attorneys, private investigators, and, at times, the FBI, all examined different parts of his life and the allegations around him. And when it was over, when the investigations ended, when the trials concluded, when the documents were unsealed, what did they actually show? That's what this documentary is about. We're going to break down the FBI material piece by piece. The extortion schemes that targeted Michael throughout his career, the violent threats from disturbed individuals claiming underworld connections, the two major child molestation investigations and what role, if any, the FBI really played, and why, despite all of this, no federal criminal case was ever brought against him. This is FBI Files. What investigators secretly collected on Michael Jackson? The files are public. The facts are documented. But the full story, that's what most people have never heard. Let's dive in. On December 22, 2009, 6 months after Michael Jackson's sudden death, the Federal Bureau of Investigation did something that instantly fueled headlines. It released a large collection of documents related to one of the most famous people on Earth. The publicly released material ran to 333 pages. Those pages were drawn from a larger body of FBI records that had accumulated over the years, some of which remain redacted or withheld. They were posted in the FBI's online vault and quickly circulated around the world. So what's inside? Contrary to the way it was often portrayed, the FBI files on Michael Jackson are not simply a long federal investigation into him as a suspect. In fact, a significant portion of the documents concern threats, extortion attempts, and security issues in which Michael was the target, not the accused. Different files cover different themes. One portion of the release involves a threatening letter sent to Michael and his family. The writer claimed he would harm Jackson unless certain demands were met. The FBI opened a case, evaluated the credibility of the threat, and worked with local authorities to determine how dangerous the individual really was. Another section deals with an extortion attempt. Someone was trying to extract money from Michael by threatening to release damaging information or cause harm to his reputation and safety. Once again, the FBI became involved to investigate the would-be extortionist, not Michael. There are files documenting threats made against Michael and other public figures in the early 1990s. These weren't casual, angry messages from random fans. Some included specific references to violent acts and deadlines. Because they crossed state lines and involved high-profile targets, the FBI stepped in to assess and investigate. One of the most detailed sets of documents focuses on a man who repeatedly threatened to kill Michael Jackson, his family, and even other celebrities and politicians. In his letters, he claimed links to organized crime and at one point described himself as related to John Gotti, the infamous Gambino crime boss. The FBI investigated him across multiple jurisdictions, interviewed him, and ultimately he was arrested and prosecuted. The files showed the Bureau treating him as a serious threat, even though his supposed mob ties turned out to be fabricated. Another segment concerned smaller extortion-related matters, again centering on people trying to profit from Michael's fame through fear, blackmail, or intimidation. In these documents, Jackson appears consistently as the victim or intended victim. The largest block of pages is devoted to a collection of death threats and extortion plots that followed Michael throughout his career. Some were grandiose, others more subtle. Some referenced other public figures, indicating a broader pattern of targeting celebrities. The FBI's role here was primarily protective, tracking threats, evaluating risk, and assisting prosecutions where possible. Only part of the FBI release touches on the most controversial side of Michael Jackson's story, the allegations of child molestation. Here, it's crucial to understand the limits of the Bureau's involvement. The 1993 allegations involving Jordan Chandler were investigated primarily by the Los Angeles Police Department and the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office, under the supervision of California prosecutors. The FBI's role, as reflected in the files, was mostly to provide technical assistance when requested, to coordinate with other agencies, and to evaluate certain pieces of evidence that might cross state or national lines. The criminal case ended without charges. The matter was resolved through a civil settlement, and the family declined to pursue further criminal action. In the early 2000s, when new allegations surfaced involving another boy and his family, the case again originated at the state level. The Santa Barbara County District Attorney's Office led the investigation and prosecution that resulted in the 2005 trial. The FBI files show that federal agents met with local authorities, reviewed certain materials, and stood ready to assist. But there is no indication that the Bureau ever brought its own separate criminal case. On June 13, 2005, after a highly publicized trial, Michael Jackson was found not guilty on all counts by a unanimous jury. The FBI's documents, as released in 2009, reflect these outcomes. They note that Jackson was investigated by California agencies, that he faced trial, and that he was acquitted. Nowhere in the release material is there evidence of a federal charge being filed against him. So why the confusion? Because the idea that the FBI had a file on Michael Jackson sounds inherently incriminating. In reality, the files show a complex mix of protective work, threat investigations, and limited support for state-level cases far from a single, sustained, federal pursuit of him as a criminal suspect. That's what the vault documents actually contain. One of the most striking things you realize when reading the FBI documents on Michael Jackson is just how frequently he was targeted not by law enforcement, but by dangerous or desperate individuals chasing his money, his fame, or his attention. Being Michael Jackson wasn't just about stadiums and screaming fans. It came with a constant shadow of risk. Some of the most detailed FBI files revolve around threats and extortion. In the early 1990s, federal agents became involved in a case where a man sent a series of threatening letters directed at Michael Jackson. These weren't vague insults. They contained explicit threats of violence and suggested that the writer knew enough about Michael's movements to cause real harm. The FBI opened an investigation. Agents examined the letters, traced their origin, interviewed people who knew the sender, and worked with local police. The documents show the slow, methodical process of turning a stack of disturbing words on paper into an actual criminal case against a real person. But it didn't stop there. In another case, someone attempted to extort Michael by claiming to have damaging information that would be made public if they were not paid. The FBI stepped in, not to investigate Michael, but to investigate the person attempting the shakedown. Federal agents documented communications, gathered evidence, and built a case to protect the victim of the scheme, Michael Jackson. One of the most unsettling episodes involved a man who repeatedly threatened to kill Michael Jackson, his family, and other public figures. He sent dozens of letters, some to Michael's representatives, some to government agencies, and some even to the media. In these letters, he claimed links to organized crime and at one point presented himself as a relative of John Gotti, the notorious crime boss. The FBI treated these threats as serious. Multiple field offices became involved because the letters were sent from different locations. Agents interviewed the man, evaluated his claims, and determined that while his supposed mob lineage appeared to be fabricated, his threats were nonetheless credible enough to warrant prosecution. The files detail how he was eventually arrested and sentenced. There were other patterns too. Some individuals wrote to Michael demanding money, saying they would reveal secrets if he didn't pay. Others threatened self-harm in an attempt to manipulate his team into responding. A few letters expressed a disturbing combination of obsession, delusion, and aggression, classic signs of what security experts now call fixated threats. In many of these cases, the FBI's role was to distinguish between fantasy and genuine danger and to intervene when the line was crossed. Why does this matter to the story of Michael Jackson's FBI files? Because when people hear FBI file, they often imagine agents staking out a suspect, building a case against them. But in large parts of these documents, Michael isn't described as a suspect at all. He is described as a target's arm, one being protected, not pursued. This context is crucial when we look at how the files were reported in 2009. Some headlines implied that the FBI had been monitoring or investigating Jackson for years, as if he were the primary focus of suspicion. Technically, his name was indeed in the files. But the reason his name appears so often is because criminals and unstable individuals kept writing it in their threats and demands. In other words, they were after him, and the FBI was after them. The documents also note that Jackson wasn't the only celebrity or public figure facing this kind of harassment. Some of the same individuals directed threats at politicians, other entertainers, and institutions. Michael's case fits into a broader pattern. High-profile individuals become magnets for people looking for leverage, money, or a twisted form of connection. For Michael Jackson, this constant pressure existed on top of everything else: his career, his personal struggles, and the massive media spotlight. The FBI files show that behind the scenes, federal agents were sometimes part of the effort to keep him physically safe and to stop the people who wanted to use fear for profit. Yet when these documents were released, much of that nuance was lost. Instead of a conversation about how fame can turn a person into a target for criminals and extortionists, the story was often framed as Michael Jackson had an FBI file, with an implied tone of suspicion. But if you read the pages themselves, a different narrative emerges. Yes, Michael Jackson was associated with multiple FBI case files, but again and again in those records, he appears as the complainant, the threatened party, or the person being protected, not as the person agents were building a federal criminal case against. Understanding that shifts the way we see both Michael and the meaning of those files. So now you've seen what's really inside the FBI material on Michael Jackson. Not rumors, not edited sound bites, actual law enforcement records, threat assessments, extortion cases, coordination with local police, and references to one of the most publicized trials in modern pop culture ending in a full acquittal. You've heard how much of the FBI's work involved protecting Michael from people who wanted to harm or exploit him. You've heard how, despite years of scrutiny and cooperation with state investigations, no federal criminal charges were ever filed against him. And you've seen how different that reality is from the way FBI files are sometimes used in conversation or headlines. Now we want to hear from you. Did any of this surprise you? Were you aware that a large part of the FBI documents deals with threats and extortion, rather than Michael as a primary suspect? Had you ever read about the specific cases where the Bureau stepped in to protect him, rather than prosecute him? Let us know in the comments what you think about how these files have been portrayed and whether your view of Michael Jackson's story has changed after seeing what's actually in the record. If this deep dive helped you see the bigger picture, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're here to go beyond the headlines, to look at documents, court records, and primary sources, the things that rarely make it into a tabloid article. Thanks for watching FBI Files. What investigators secretly collected on Michael Jackson? The evidence is there. The files are public. The question is, what do we choose to believe?